I've had more than a few requests to talk about the purchase of a souvenir plot of land to obtain the titles of Lord and Lady, or Laird as it's sometimes referred to, which translates to Lord. And so I thought I would go into a little bit of detail in this video as to what is really going on when companies sell these souvenir plots of land and people think that they obtain these titles. As you probably expect, there's a little bit more to it than just buy the plot of land and on you pop with your title and then you can sit in the House of Lords. That's certainly not how it works. So starting right at the beginning, all in an overview fashion, to sit in the House of Lords, there are essentially two main types of lord, either a hereditary peer, which as the name suggests is a peerage, a title which is passed down through the family, but the vast majority are what are referred to as life peers. So they are appointed as a life peer, and again, as the name suggests, a peerage for their lifetime, which does not pass on to any other member of their family. Others might obtain the title of Lord by virtue of certain roles that they hold and therefore eligible to sit in the House of Lords. However, with many of these websites claiming that you can just purchase a plot of land and then pop on Lord and Lady onto your personal identification documents and go about using it, there's a little bit more to it than that. Now, of course, if you're just doing it for a little bit of a gimmick or a gift or some other kind of novelty gift, which is a bit fun to pass around and a bit of fun to use as you go about your daily life, that's one thing. It would be entirely another thing, which, as the comment that prompted me to do this video this morning suggested, that some people might be using this Lord and Lady title as obtained from one of these websites to apply for loans. And the particular context of that message was that somebody might be much more likely to obtain said loan if they were a lord or lady. That's where we get into some potential hot water. So, backing up for a moment, let's look at what these titles actually might mean, how they might be used, and what effect they might have on your everyday daily life. Now, it would be one thing to go into a restaurant, introduce yourself, let's say if it were me introducing myself as Lord Shensmith, I booked a table and so on and so forth. I actually used to know somebody that did exactly this, and I witnessed it firsthand, and quite frankly, it worked. They believed that this chap was a lord. They hoofed somebody else off the waiting list and put him in their place. That's one thing, because no one's actually really losing anything of any kind of monetary value by doing so. It's a bit of a gimmick. The restaurant feels like they're hosting a lord. The would-be imposter lord feels like they get some kind of special royalty treatment because they are seated ahead of somebody else, and so on. It's entirely another matter, however, that brings it within the realm of potential legal difficulty and potentially criminality. If someone were to use said Lord and Lady titles to obtain some kind of financial gain or preferential financial impact by using said title, if in fact that title is not genuine. Now, if one were a genuine hereditary or life peer and therefore eligible potentially to sit in the House of Lords. By the way, it's not a given that all peers can sit in the House of Lords. There was movement by government to limit those that can sit in the House of Lords, but maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later in the video when we talk about the registration and things like this. But if someone is using these titles and if one genuinely has a hereditary or peer title and they apply for certain financial loans and things like that, they might well be more likely to get them. I have been out of the financial advice industry for long enough that I don't really know whether that's going to have any impact in today's financial market at all. I suspect that it probably would, because most financial institutions do look at things from a risk-based perspective and so on. So I do know that for certain professions, if you hold a certain profession, for example, barrister, they ask you what your profession is. Now, this is not abusing the title and your profession in the slightest, but they do ask sometimes what your profession is or what your role is. And I do know from the financial institution's perspective, if you put doctor or barrister or chartered accountant or chartered engineer or something like that, you tend to get a more favourable response from the bank. So doubtless the same would be true if one had a genuine hereditary or life peerage. However, that is precisely why there is a potential legal problem and potential criminality with buying essentially your way into one of these titles from one of these websites. Now, before we dive into some of the detail, what I will do is show you one screenshot from one said website, which is Highland Titles. Now, you'll see on this screenshot of their website here, it says over 300,000 people have become lords and ladies of Glencoe. And you'll note the asterisk, well, I do as a lawyer. And so you look further down the page for that part of that reference to the asterisk. And it says, you obtain a personal right to a souvenir plot of land, which we'll come back to in a moment, and our permission to use our registered trademarks, Laird, Lord and Lady of Glencoe. Now that, after some research, which I won't go into in a great deal of detail in this video, some research suggests, for argument's sake, rather than being a statement of fact for any lawyers listening, but it suggests that this is a trademark registered somewhere else. I believe it was Estonia from the article that I read. And these registered trademarks are Laird of Glencoe, Lord of Glencoe and Lady of Glencoe. And so by purchasing from this website, it provides you, as this caption and asterisk qualification says, permission to use those trademarks. So if you were purchasing through this website, you have the right to a souvenir plot, which I'll come back to in a moment, and permission to use the trademarks. So the way that some of these websites work, and at least I'm not sure for Highland Titles because I haven't dived into the website itself, but some of those that I've looked at in the past provide you a way of referring to yourself formally and legally as, let's say, Lord Shensmith. And so the way that those did it was by a change of name. So when I looked at this before, again, this is not to say it's the same for Highland Titles. It may not be. I haven't dived in to try to buy this to see how that's working with Highland Titles, but certainly one of them that I looked at it in the past, the way that they encourage you to do it was to formally and officially and legally change your name. And the way you would do it is thus. You would change your first name to Lord or Lady. You would change then your middle name to become your original first name. And then you can have multiple middle names. So if you had a middle name originally, then your second middle name would become your original middle name. And then, of course, your family name remains your family name. So then officially and formally, legally, you are then known as, let's say myself, Lord Daniel Shensmith. So that would then be my full and formal legal name. What it doesn't do, however, and this is the real key point here, which is what a lot of people are asking the question over, what it doesn't do is make you suddenly an official lord or lady of any kind of realm. So to explain that a little bit further, we'll now dive into what a souvenir plot really means. And this is something that the Law Society for Scotland has gone into quite a bit of detail about, and what the Court of Lord Lyon has gone into a great amount of detail about. That is responsible for issuing coat of arms, and we'll come back to coat of arms again in a moment, because that is also important, because a lot of people confuse the coat of arms with a lord or ladyship, which is not quite the same thing. One is not necessarily entitled to the other and vice versa. So first of all, talking about the souvenir plot and what a souvenir plot really means. Now let's talk about first of all what people think that this souvenir plot will mean. Most people think that by obtaining this souvenir plot, buying this souvenir plot, somehow, and it sounds feasible, that you buy a plot of land which is within a certain realm. In the case of Highland Titles, Glencoe, people think that they buy this souvenir plot of land, and therefore, because they own land, they become a lord or lady because that's part of that land. However, looking at the souvenir plots in particular, because that is specifically what we're talking about here, the Land Registration Scotland Act of 1979 removes the normal requirements to register this land, thus permitting the sale to take place under contract law, so it wouldn't be registered. But there's a very important distinction about doing so, about buying and selling land under simple contract law as opposed to under the Land Registration Scotland Act, because this land is obviously in Scotland. In order to fully uphold and protect your rights in respect of land, you need to be a registered land holder. But because souvenir plots are specifically removed from that, under this law, the keeper is required to reject an application for registration in the Land Register if the land to which it relates meets the description of a souvenir plot. Now, a particular feature of a souvenir plot is that it's of inconsiderable size, meaning you wouldn't be able to obtain planning permission to do anything with it. You can't actually do anything on the land other than maybe go and look at it, but then you'd need permission from everybody else to even access that land and so on. So being a souvenir plot, that literally is what it is. So a souvenir plot is defined by the Land Registration Act of Scotland in 1979, defined as a piece of land which, being of inconsiderable size or no practical utility, is unlikely to be wanted in isolation except for the sake of mere ownership or for sentimental reasons or commemorative purposes. And so being a piece of land of inconsiderable size, clearly you cannot do anything from it. Now, one thing lawyers have had to contend with is when they're looking at these pieces of land, it may not be of an inconsiderable size and may not be coming within the exemption for registration, but that's not what we're talking about here. So the other important thing is, the most obvious thing, the big elephant in the room, is that there is no title that comes along with this souvenir plot of land. Now, the Court of Lord Lyon, which, as I mentioned earlier, is responsible for coats of arms, which I will come back to in a moment, also talks about titles that go along with pieces of land as well. And the Court of Lord Lyon has commented that ownership of a souvenir plot of land does not bring with it the right to any description such as laird, lord or lady. And laird is not a title, but it's a description applied to those living on or around the estate, many of whom will derive their living from it, to the principal landowner of a long-named area of land. So laird is a little bit different to lord, but it's sort of a translation, but it refers to someone that has a residential property and derive their living from the land. So the Court of Lord Lyon goes on, it will therefore be seen that it's not a description which is appropriate for the owner of a normal residential property. So it's someone that derives the living from the land. It goes on, it cannot properly be used to describe a person who owns a small part of a larger piece of land. The term laird is not one recognisable by attachment to a personal name, and thus there is no official recognition of XY laird of Z. However, the words lord and lady apply to those on whom a peerage has been confirmed and do not relate to the ownership of land. Ownership of a souvenir plot of land is not sufficient to bring a person otherwise ineligible within the jurisdiction of Lord Lyon for seeking of a coat of arms. So, in short, you do not obtain a formal legal title with these souvenir plots of land, nor the right to seek a coat of arms, which is the bit that I said I would come back to. So a coat of arms is distinct from a lord or lady in the sense that it relates to a family. A clan, for example, cannot have a coat of arms, but it must be within a family that originally had a coat of arms if you can trace back your ancestry long enough to someone that did, and therefore you can make the application. It takes about 12 months to apply for this and going through various checks and so on to ultimately grant you with this coat of arms, and you pay fees and that kind of thing. But ultimately that relates back to families that had an original coat of arms. Again, doesn't relate to the land, and again doesn't relate to these titles. So somewhat different and somewhat distinct. So in short and in conclusion, buying a souvenir plot of land neither gives you a legal formal title with any of those benefits that may be attracted from it, nor does it allow you to obtain a coat of arms, and nor does it allow you to sit in the House of Lords. And the warning that comes along with all of this, which is really what sparked this video today, is if someone were only likely, and this is the real key in the question, if somebody were only likely to get a certain type of loan because they are a lord or lady, would that be wrong to do so? My view on that would be probably yes. Probably it would be wrong, and it may even be criminally wrong, for the reason that simple fraud is a lot simpler than people think it is. If you make a false statement dishonestly with a view to make a gain for yourself or a loss to another, that might amount to fraud. Now, the dishonesty aspect may fall away in this scenario if somebody genuinely believes that they got this title and genuinely believes that it entitles them to something more, such as preferential loan rates and so on and so forth. However, if they come within the knowledge, let's say they've taken advice and it can be shown that they knew that it was being dishonest in doing so, or let's say that they went one step further and said that this title has been passed down from a family member when it hasn't, such as a hereditary peership or something like that, but they refer to themselves as lord or lady whatever, and if they say that it's been passed down, that would certainly be dishonest because they would know it not to be true. And if they made that statement, which is false, dishonestly, in order to make a gain or a loss to somebody else, and that gain could take a number of different forms, particularly taking into account the relatively new or refined test for dishonesty between the cases of Ivy and Genting casinos as against the original Gauche test. Simply put, originally it was a test of dishonesty on two parts: whether general society would find that it was dishonest and whether the defendant themselves would find it to be dishonest. The new and revised test is we don't really care so much about what the defendant thinks, because as a society we shouldn't be lowering our standards to what one individual thinks is honest or not. So if a ordinary, reasonable and honest person believes that said act is dishonest, then it's likely to be found to be dishonest. So if someone were to buy a souvenir plot, change their name to Lord, Lady, whatever, and then go on to tell some financial institution that they inherited this title, for example, in my view, that has a very serious risk of becoming fraud. So my warning to you is don't bother, or at least don't do it without taking full and formal legal advice. But of course, this is not, this is guidance, this is my discussion and my views on the situation. So as a gift and a gimmick, I think it's perfectly fine. But the other potential problem is, if you do go through this process and formally and legally change your name, you may have all sorts of other complications thereafter, because one of the common problems when people get married, obviously they change their name, it obliterates their credit record. They lose essentially any credit that they've built up in their name because suddenly they've got a different name. What they need to do is get their name tied with their original credit profile, and therefore rectify the problem of becoming married and changing their name and so on. It's often not a problem if they have joint accounts because they will be tied together, but very often that can cause problems. So I hope you heed that warning. I hope that's been somewhat educational, entertaining, useful. As I said, no statements of fact made about any website here for legal reasons, but all of which is my legal view on the situation regards titles, Lord, Lady, of wherever. I hope you found that interesting. Please do smash that like button and subscribe. And as always, I thank you for watching.